Okay, good morning, and well, word of prayer and turn it over to Riley. He's going to share his article, and then we'll continue on in our study. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for your blessing this week. Thank you for a beautiful morning. Thank you for the privilege of being molded and shaped by the Spirit of God in everything you do in our lives. So you leave nothing out, and we're grateful that what we're going to hear and talk about in this class contributes to that, and I pray that you would be greatly honored as we focus our attention on the subject matter of this morning. And pray for Riley, too, as he shares, that what he has to say would also be just useful and a contributing factor in your work in each of our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, sir, you're on. I'll give you the mic here so you can, you can hold it or hook it wherever you want to do. All right. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Okay, so I had the article, Why Communicate the Gospel Through Stories, and it was about a missionary telling what he did when he was missionarying to, is that the correct term, missionarying to? Yeah. Ministering to the people in the Philippines. And so it basically told about the power of a story and how you can use stories to tell the gospel to other people instead of just using the Western way of just using our thought and intellect and basically the Apostle Paul's letters to tell the gospel through stories that way. And he had 8 main points, and that the first one was that storytelling is a universal form of communication. So in other countries, they would tell stories in order to communicate something to them, such as how we got here. They would tell the story of evolution or creation. And the second one was that more than half of the world's population prefer the concrete mode of learning, which is how this happened, which is how they communicate through stories, and instead of the Western thinking mindset. And it's actually shifting more in the Western world towards the concrete way because of the illiterate rates rising and the television actually, which is prompting more and more Westerners to just look at screens and to just want to hear the stories instead of thinking and using their brains and having the actual concepts. The third point was that stories connect our imagination and emotions, which if you hear a good story, it will automatically go and you'll think about it throughout the day, and it'll just be in your imagination. And yeah. The fourth point was that approximately 75% of the Bible story is actually narrative or story. The other 15% is going to be poetry, and then the last 10% is going to be the thought organized part of the Bible, which is like the letters that the Apostle Paul has written. And if I could read a quote, it says, "The Bible was not given to reveal the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but to reveal the hand of God in the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not as a revelation of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, but as a revelation of the Savior of Mary and Martha and Lazarus." So people often when preaching, they spend all the time in preaching in the 10% category of the Bible, when there's actually 75% that is actually narrative that we can give to other people and that we should be reading. The fifth point was that every major religion uses stories to socialize its young, convert potential followers, and indoctrinate members. That is religions such as Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, and Christianity. We all use the stories of our religious books to tell other people about Christ and to convert members, because the stories stick with people and they'll think it over and it will be in their imagination. The sixth point was that stories create instant evangelists. And now the example that he gave in this was he he was having trouble telling the gospel to the Philippine people the normal Western way through logic and reasoning. And so he switched it up and switched to telling them just the stories of the gospel and the stories of the Bible through the Old Testament and the New Testament. And they got that a lot quicker, and they would start to process and think about the stories, and then they would get saved through the stories. And then, because they thought the stories were so good, they would go and tell all the other people, all their friends and family, about the stories. And then everyone was becoming a Christian, and it was really cool to read. The seventh point was that Jesus taught theology through stories. And although we often teach our theology through the books of the apostles, Jesus would teach his theology through parables and stories, such as like the parable of the sower, or talking about the kingdom of heaven, or something else. And yeah, basically the point of the article was just to think about the stories and think about how they could be a huge help in telling other people the gospel. So, yeah.
Hey, good. Thanks. You did a good job of that. Appreciate it. If I were to ask, is there anybody in here that does not like a story? I would be shocked if somebody said, I don't like stories. Everybody likes stories. Now, there may be certain kinds of stories that you like or don't like, but everybody likes stories. Why? They're interesting. All right, Jules?
They're entertaining. They can make our day.
Okay, they're entertaining. What was the last thing you said?
They can make our day.
They can make your day. Okay. All right, what else, Paul?
It can be related to your life.
Yeah, stories connect us with reality. Yeah, which is one of the reasons that they're so popular universally. I'm going to come back to our notes, but I just want to pick up on a couple things you said, because that's a really, really fascinating topic. I wish we could take a couple of classes just to talk about this. Does this word ring a bell with anybody? Justin, does you recognize that?
I mean, more is the first part oral, like the idea of something you speak
Yeah, something that is spoken.
in. Yeah.
Right. This is a whole study that, I mean, just a whole realm, a whole science of cultures that are basically illiterate. And I hope that you guys all understand that illiterate doesn't mean stupid. The fact that somebody doesn't have a language or doesn't read doesn't make them stupid. Okay, everybody understands that, right? Sometimes there's that connotation attached, and I think we need to detach it. Oral cultures are cultures that do not have a written language, or where the vast majority of people do not read and write, but they can be extremely intelligent people. So orality is the study of how do you communicate the gospel. You've all played telephone, and you know the dangers of trying to pass a story on from one culture to another. We've talked a little bit about that. Let me throw another statement up here. What is a proposition? Or a propositional statement?
Is it a truth claim?
It's a truth claim, exactly. The Western world thrives on propositional statements because we thrive on objective truth, and you used the word concrete and abstract. So would the West be primarily concrete or abstract? Yeah.
Concrete,
Now, why would you say that?
because we get straight to the point right away.
Okay, all right. What does concrete mean?
There's not much wiggle room, or like you get the point of the story.
Okay, so we could use the word objective, something that is objective. We like that in the West. Now, it's kind of strange because there is a sense in which the West is concrete. When it comes to propositional statements, we want to state things that are very specific and very clear, objectivity. But there is another sense in which the West is very abstract. And that has to do with the way that we communicate this truth. Okay, I want you to just think about that. In the vast majority of the world, truth is communicated by, Riley, stories. It is, and stories are actually a concrete way of sharing truth because it deals with real life living, everyday living. And so it is, there's a sense in which the West is concrete, but there's also a sense in which it's abstract. Just like certain languages are concrete and abstract. And so, anyway, it's a fascinating study. What I want to encourage you guys to do, and I've probably mentioned this before, and I'll mention it again, there's nothing wrong with propositional statements, truth claims, but if the only way that we teach people and preach the word and communicate is by bullet points and outlines and things like that, we're gonna have a problem in the vast majority of the world's cultures. We just are. Most cultures relate to a story. And you mentioned the fact that Jesus, taught objective truth through stories. He actually was able to take propositional truth statements and make them, communicate them by way of story. And I'm not against bullet points and outlines, but we are so profuse in our use of that in the Western world that I think sometimes we miss out on opportunities to really bring the truth alive, Paul, as you said, make it relate to everyday living through stories. When I was in college, stories were for women and children. Women took story classes, men took theology classes. Women learned how to tell stories, we learned how to make propositional statements. And there was a dichotomy there that I think is we're starting to close the loop on that, we're starting to close the gap, but we have a long way to go. So it's a fascinating study, and I appreciate you sharing that. Those were some good points in the article. All right. What percent did you say the article said was narrative in the book? Yeah, 75. And some will say it's closer to like 50%. The difference is that it depends on what you include. For instance, the book of Job, okay, is Job narrative or is Job something else? What part of the genre of the Old Testament does Job fall in? Poetry. So some would not include Job because it's a poetic book. Nonetheless, it is a real human story. So that's why you have a difference in what part of the Bible you consider to be narrative. It depends on whether you're including the genre in which it was written or the actual content of the book. But if you're looking at the actual content itself, regardless of the genre, you're close when you say 70-75% of the Bible is narrative. Because there's narrative in the epistles. Normally the epistles would be included in something, but Paul gives narrative information in Philippians talking about his past, or Galatians, what happened when he got saved. So anyway, I'm getting way off the subject, but it's just such a neat topic, and appreciate you sharing that. Who is on next time? Let's see, who can we? Looks like Jules. The difference bonding makes. What day do you prefer?
Probably Friday.
Okay, a week from today? Okay, we'll plan on that. All right, let me get back to the notes. Kind of left off right in the middle of this. I'm going to go back and just, I suppose it helps if I turn the screen on. Okay, don't worry, your eyes are good. This is on purpose. All right. Well, no, I'm having a problem with my, oh dear. Let's try this again. Okay, we filled in some of this, okay? And again, in the notes, as I mentioned last time, we're not following them exactly. I'm dealing with the A, C, E, and G right now. That's the first point in each of those brackets. So we've already filled in communication in a low context culture where you need a lot of specifics. Communication is explicit and direct. The meeting place is based more on convenience, appearances of little importance. I think we stopped maybe here. When there is misunderstanding, the communicator has failed. Explicit meanings are important. And I kind of rushed with this statement at the end. How many of you have heard the statement, if the student hasn't learned, finish it. The teacher hasn't taught, okay? We could discuss that. In the Western world, that is the prevailing opinion. It is my responsibility to make sure you learn. And if you haven't learned, I haven't taught, okay? And so the idea is that I am expected to be explicit and specific enough that you get it, all right? Now, we'll come back to that on the other side here. Then finally, emphasis on clarification, signage, and directions. I think we may have mentioned this before, but give me an example in our country of this, of a high level of clarification. Where would you find that in our society? Just get on the highway. Look at the signage, okay? What kind of signage do you find on the highway? Very explicit, okay? What about our laws? You better be very specific. Did you ever buy a house? You probably haven't bought a house. Your parents maybe did. We spent 45 minutes when we closed on our house just signing. And most of the documents I signed, I had no clue what I was signing. I just trusted my realtor who was with us. He says, here, just sign here. Okay, sign here. I had no idea what I was signing. 45 minutes of signing documents. We took almost a book full of papers because all of that specificity is necessary in our culture, okay? That is very low context. Communication is highly dependent, now that we're moving to the high context culture, communication is highly dependent on picking up cues from the context. Have you ever spoken to somebody and you can tell by the person's body language or facial expression that something isn't quite right? You're talking and you're not getting the reaction that you think. You're picking up cues. Okay, in our culture, that does happen. It happens in any culture. But in the non-Western world, it happens so much that many times you don't have to ever completely explain exactly what you're saying. Just by the cues that people pick up, you can communicate. All right? And then, so now that was letter B, okay? Did we fill in letter A, number 1? Okay, number 1 is people say what they mean. Now, let me explain that. That does not mean that in the 2/3 majority world, people lie. What it does mean is that people might not get to the point that they're trying to make right away. So it's not that they're lying, it's just that they don't want to say specifically what they're trying to say right up front, because that would be considered offensive to the listener. Yeah, Ella?
I feel like that's kind of how it is in like rural versus like cities and those communities, because like I grew up in a really small town and everyone in the community like beats around the bush and no one ever gets to the point about anything. They don't want to offend you. Like nobody's direct with the way they talk.
But are you able to discern what they're getting at nonetheless?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. You know them well enough that you can kind of tell where they're going with this, even if they don't come right to the point.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you consider that good or bad, or is it just kind of the way?
I don't like it. I think it's frustrating. I wish people would just be direct and say things.
Mm-hmm.
But, I mean, you still understand what they're saying when you grow up in that culture of knowing how people just talk like that.
Yeah. Can somebody give me an example of something that Jesus said that was not straight up beating around the bush more? Or was Jesus always direct? Yeah, Miriam?
Maybe when he talked about his death, that he will destroy the temple and then rebuild it again.
Okay, he did use that language. Now, with his disciples, he was direct, right? We're going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be delivered to the authorities. I'm going to be killed and rise again. But when he was standing before the leaders, he said, destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And they're scratching their heads like, what's this all about? Riley, did you say something?
I said in parables.
In parables. Yeah. Now, we do know from Matthew 13 that the reason he spoke in parables was because he had been very plain at the beginning and many people rejected his message. And so by switching to parables, he actually created confusion for those who did not have a heart to understand. At least that was part of the reason. Can you think of another example of Jesus beating around the bush and not getting directly to the point at the beginning of a conversation? Yeah.
I'm thinking of the woman at the well.
Yeah. He's very, very cautious about the way he approaches that subject. He doesn't just walk up to her and say, you're an immoral woman. It takes quite a while for him to get to that. And actually, he never even gets to the point of calling her an adulteress. He implies it when he says, yeah, you've already had 5 men and the one you're living with now is not your husband. So, but he doesn't really come out and explicitly call her an adulteress. But it becomes obvious, and there's no doubt on either side what he's saying. So Ella, that's a tool that can be used and abused. And a lot of it comes back to motive. If the motive for which I am not being explicit is because I really don't want to deal with it, then I'm wrong. But if the motive is, okay, I want to be very careful because I respect Ella and I don't want to unnecessarily hurt her, offend her, so I'm going to be gentle in the way I come to this subject. Now I think that that's a pure motive. And in some cultures, to come directly to the point is an offense to them right off the bat. They feel like, whoa, And so saving face, considering the person is a consideration in this. But yeah, it's a fascinating subject. So, okay. All right, number 2, the meeting place is based on what will communicate to the other party. We talked about weddings, and things like that where the decor is very important. Appearance is very important. It's subjective. We talked about athletic competitions where, the smell of popcorn and things like that help to create the ambiance that you want. Okay? Some of you, ladies who, maybe gentlemen too, even in your homes, you might find yourself more given to, I've got to communicate. There are people that will always use a theme to decorate their homes. This idea of just putting cutesy things all over the place is they want a theme. So when people come to their house, they're attracted to that theme. Okay? So again, some of that is personality. It's not necessarily always a cultural thing. Anybody like that here? You like to decorate your room with theme? Maybe your roommate isn't so interested in that, but you like to. We won't go there. When there is misunderstanding, this is down to letter E, high context. When there is misunderstanding, the listener has failed to pick up on that's supposed to be cues, not cures. Oh, hold on, let me fix that right now. Cues, there we go. Okay, the listener has failed to pick up on the cues. Implied meanings are important. So, I'm teaching this class, and everybody fails the course. Okay? I'm being very hyperbolic here. Whose fault is it? Well, in a high context culture, it's your fault. Now, let me ask you this. Didn't we say in another class that that in some cultures, students do not ask questions in class because it implies that the teacher hasn't taught? How do you reconcile that with this idea? Because the same culture will have both of those characteristics. Oh, okay. You understand? Let's take Japan again. I'm in Japan. I'm teaching. Nobody asks any questions because that implies that I haven't taught well. And yet in that culture, if the student hasn't learned, it's his or her fault. So how do they get around it? Yeah.
Does that have to do with the power distance too? Like Japan is very high power distance and you don't want to make the teacher lose face.
Exactly. Yes. So But if the responsibility to learn is on your shoulders and yet you can't ask questions in class because it caused me to lose face, aren't you in a catch-22? How do they deal with that? Yeah.
Don't they like go to a smarter student and ask them?
Exactly. There are ways to get the answer. And by the way, that's not Googling, okay? Although they might. We're dealing right now with artificial intelligence. And I probably shouldn't even tell you guys this, but you're probably way out ahead of me anyway on this. But we just talked about this in a faculty meeting. Artificial intelligence is providing well-done papers that that you don't have to do anything to accomplish. I can tell you guys that because I think you have a level of integrity that puts me on safe ground. But I had a student just show me once he took one of my assignments, and he used artificial intelligence to produce a report on it. It was awesome. I would never have known that it wasn't done by a student. Now, if you're tempted because of what I said to do that, the problem is yours. But yeah, there are ways to get answers. And normally, you're right, Jules, normally what will happen in Japanese culture, or one like that, is afterwards you find one of the smart students in the class and everybody goes, hey, what was he saying? Can you explain this to us? So the teacher saves face, and yet the student gets the answer he needs. Yeah, Emma?
Is there a way to privately and respectfully ask the teacher in those cultures, or like we can make it?
Yeah, normally that would be done outside the classroom. The student, and again, you have to understand we're being very stereotypical, right? There are variations of this. But the simple answer is after class, the student could approach the professor and say, thank you for the class, that was very helpful. I failed to understand something. In other words, the student will take that responsibility on himself or herself. My mind was wandering at that time. I apologize. Could I ask you to please explain that to me one more time? So the student is presenting himself or herself as the culprit, the one who's at fault, rather than saying, what you said there didn't make sense. You didn't explain it very well. They would never do that. Does that make sense? Yeah. Now, in our culture, in fact, in our culture, it's so much the opposite that if students never ask questions in class, the professor walks out thinking, are they even interested in the subject? We actually, as professors here in America, we, to some degree, and this is probably true in Germany as well, in the West, we measure to some degree our effectiveness in the classroom on the interest that the students manifest by asking questions. Right, Paul?
Well, because I went to private school in Congo, it's the professor when asks a student a question. Students cannot. So the professor will ask the questions to engage the student's mind to make sure they understand what he's teaching.
Mm-hmm.
So the student cannot ask, but the professor has to ask to make sure that whatever he's lecturing on, the students are able to comprehend that.
Okay, but would the students initiate the questions to the professors? No. Just totally off of our radar. It's so different from how we do it here. Yeah. If you guys are asking all kinds of questions for clarifications, I walk out here just pumped. I think, man, they are really engaged in this class. See? I realize at 7 and 8 in the morning, that's a lot to ask anyway, but I have an advantage. I have to be awake and up here standing. But if I were sitting where you are, I'm not going to tell you how many times I struggled with sleepiness when I was a college student, but I did. All right, and then finally, I don't know why this thing is acting up. It is harder to get around directions. Directions are hard to follow. Let me give you an example. High context culture, okay? You come to visit Ankeny, you've never been here before. You say, where's there a good place to eat? And I say, Jethro's. Okay, where's that? Just get out here on this road and go south. That's all I tell you. Okay? And why do I do that? Because I'm assuming that you'll figure it out. You'll go down there and you'll see signs for places to eat and you'll figure it out. And not only that, but because these are normally collectivistic cultures, I'm also thinking once he or she gets going down there, if they get stuck, they can ask somebody else and that person will help. So you actually think of giving directions as a participation of various people. I'm not going to give you the whole directions. I don't need to. I can get you started if you need directions further down the road. In Brazil, they'd say, go down there and there's a palm tree, turn left. Well, there are palm trees all over the place. It's not quite that way, but so that's the idea. I don't feel the necessity to say, okay, now see this door right here, go out, and there's a sidewalk that winds around. Okay, get in your car on this State Street. That's this one that runs north and south. You get on State and you go down, there'll be a light there at First Street, then you go a little curve around. You'll come to John Deere on the right, there's a light there, keep on going. And after you get past John Deere, there's another, maybe one, oh man, maybe it's two lights. Hey, was it one or two lights to get down there to the next stop? Oh, two. Second light. Okay, be watching for Jethro's sign down there. See, we're very, very careful. Now, obviously with GPSs, normally you don't need that, but I'm just using this as an example. Okay? All I have to tell you now is Jethro's Ankeny, and you're there. But notice even on your GPS is how explicit the directions are, you know. So it can be frustrating if you're an American going to a place like Democratic Republic of Congo to teach, you may walk out of the classroom feeling like an absolute failure. Nobody cares, nobody, and in reality, they may be very much engaged in what you're saying. All right, questions, comments, Rotten Tomatoes? Oh, okay, is that a Rotten Tomato or a question?
No, it's a question. Would that be like how indirect and direct, like we were just talking about storytelling, kind of like the opposite of that in certain cultures? Like people who use storytelling, would they like give you specific directions or not?
Okay, I'm not sure I understand. Are you trying to relate storytelling to that? Are you asking if storytelling is more of a direct or an indirect way?
Yeah, like telling directions with indirect, would that be like more of the storytelling culture or like
It is. It is. Give me an example in the Bible where somebody told a story in order to take the pain out of what he was trying to communicate. There's a really, yeah. Yep. Yeah, when Nathan approached King David, he could have walked in and said, "You're an adulterer and a murderer," and he'd have been absolutely right. He may have lost his head over it too, I don't know. But so he walks in and he says, "I have a story to tell you." And so he's being very indirect by using story. Now, does that mean that every time that you use storying that you're being indirect? No, not necessarily. But that is typical of a culture that's more indirect, because stories enable you to arrive at the conclusion without pointing the finger at the individual at the beginning. Yeah. You ever do that with somebody? Probably not quite that way. That's unusual. All right. Good. Let's see. Okay. Did I leave anything unfilled in there under B, high context? Did we need to fill those in? Yeah, Emma?
There was another number 2 underneath A, low context.
Oh, yes, they get to the point. Little number 2 there, they get to the point or give it to you straight up. Just emphasizing what we've said. They get to the point or give it to you straight up. Yeah, and then letter B, under high context, there's a little number 1 there. People don't say what they mean partly to maintain, and what's the ultimate goal in a collectivistic culture? Social harmony, as opposed to a Western culture, which is self-actualization, right? It's about you as an individual, right? So if I have to deal, and look, church planters in this part of the world really struggle with this, because sometimes they will see the need to deal with a problem in the church, but nobody wants to raise their hand and identify the problem or the person. And because they don't want to disrupt social harmony. That's interesting. The Bible teaches that we have to purge sin in the church in order to maintain harmony in the church. But a culture like that views it just the opposite. We have to avoid dealing with problems in the church so that we can maintain social harmony. They're both headed in the same direction. They both want social harmony. But one of them sees social harmony as a question of avoiding an issue. Another one sees social harmony as a question of weeding out the problem so that everybody's on the same page. Interesting. And so if you're serving in a church or in some sort of a Christian organization in 2/3 majority world in a high context culture, you need to be really patient because people may not be, willing right away to speak up, and you may accuse them of hiding sin and things like that. And sometimes they may be doing that, but you need to be, you probably don't want to begin by getting everybody together in a business meeting and saying, okay, we got to deal with this problem. You might want to begin by talking to individuals, okay, and finding people who are keys to this and working with them so that by the time it does become public, you've already cultivated the thinking and the feelings of people by dealing with them. Does that make sense? That all of a sudden we all got to get together and deal with this probably isn't going to work. You want to talk to people, and you may find that you can even resolve it, without bringing it to the attention of everybody. That's tricky business. A lot of missionaries get really frustrated and feel like their people are just being dishonest, and that's really not their heart. They're just wanting to be careful not to cause somebody to lose face. The issue, though, when it comes to sin, sometimes in the end, if a person is not repentant, he or she will lose face. There may become a point when that's unavoidable. But don't try to jump there too quickly in a culture like that. That's very challenging. Okay. Okay, I think we got everything else filled in, right? So number 4, down there, in any culture, certain groups are high context. Give me an example. What's a high context group in this culture? The most obvious one would be, well, church. Okay, yeah, church is usually a high context culture. Family, yeah. So the blanks there are family, religion, and profession, your job. Yep. Normally, wherever you work, everybody's thinking along the same lines because you're all in the same profession. And so there's a lot of context that doesn't require specific communication. So in any culture, certain groups are high context: family, religion, profession, etc. Okay? All right. Number 5, where does a cultural orientation toward context come from? Letter A, don't assume indirect communication is passive-aggressive behavior. Don't assume that indirect communication is passive-aggressive behavior. Now, probably all of us have done that at one time or another, right? You just shut up, don't say anything, and that's your way of getting at somebody. Again, that's personality, right? And we've all done that at some point. But don't assume that that's what they're doing. B, neuroscience has made some observations about the role of context. Now, this is science, it's neuroscience, it's not scripture, but it is part of general revelation, if you will. Number 1, Westerners, in general, enter a room and notice. Let me give you 2 options. Do Westerners enter a room and tend to notice who's most important in the room right away, or do they tend to notice the details of the room first? You say details? Anybody else? Details, Riley? Jules?
I would just say who's important, just because, in my mind, if we had someone super famous or a really, really, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a word, really interesting missionary, or if someone from a hard rich country, I wouldn't notice the details, I would notice who was there.
Okay. This is a hard question because there's going to be a little bit of both, but I think, according to neurological studies, in general, in the West, when you peek into a room, the first thing you tend to notice is who's up front, who's leading this, what's this about? And then later you may take in the details. But the first, because Westerners like to know what's going on in the room, what's the function of this meeting, and by noticing the leader, you get an idea. I walked by Linden today on my way out here. I looked into the Linden classroom, and there was Carl Kirby. Okay? Now, I do know what that room looks like anyway, but first thing I wanted to notice is who's in there today. And that tells me something about what they're going to be talking about. Westerners are more keyed to what's going to be done in the room. And you can identify that in part by noticing who's up in front, who's in charge. Whereas, number two, Easterners walk into a room and they first thing notice are the details, because in an Eastern culture, by and large, the way that the kind of room you're meeting in and the way that it's arranged is going to tell you a lot about the nature of the occasion, the meeting that's going on there. Much more so. Remember, we said that in the West, rooms are more utilitarian. As long as we can get bodies in here and keep from freezing to death or boiling in here, we'll be okay. Whereas in the Eastern, it's very important that you have the right kind of place, okay? Right decor and all that. Again, these are stereotypical. Number 6, how should we address this cultural difference in communication? 2 words that are really important. Letter A, honesty versus loyalty. The West thrives on honesty, or truth would be a related term. And there's nothing wrong with that. Obviously truth is very important. And it's not that the East doesn't care about the truth, but they want to make sure that when they get to the truth, they can do it by maintaining loyalty with people involved as much as possible. So loyalty is very, very important. If I must dishonor someone in order to preserve the truth, okay, for a Christian, that'll happen. But for unbelievers, for people that don't have a biblical worldview, then I will lie or cover up in order to maintain social harmony. Okay? But the Christian worldview won't allow that. All right, letter B, sociolinguistics. What is that? Well, that's our choice of words and how it reveals our cultural orientation. This is a huge study. Sociolinguistics. The way we talk, we just take it for granted because we've learned to communicate. And Miriam, you coming from Germany, you may notice things in the English language that we don't notice ourselves, just because we've always talked that way. But the types of words we use. Why do some cultures have a different word for you, sir, or you, ma'am, whereas we use the word you straight across the board? I'm doing a study on the history of the English language right now. I don't know if you're aware of this. I was not. That thee and thou and ye used to be the street language in the old English world, and you was the formal. Today, it's just the opposite. If you hear somebody reading from the King James, for example, that sounds like the ultra-formal English, the classical English, where you is the more street. It's flip-flopped. And there are cultural and historical reasons that has taken place. Those are things we don't even notice. But if you're in a different culture, pay attention to the way and types of words that are used. C, double-voiced discourse. Anybody here studied linguistics at all in that area? You know what double-voiced discourse is? It's dual orientation, as if that helps, right? Dual orientation in speech. In other words, it's an awareness of self and of the one with whom you're communicating. I'll give you 2 examples here of how, in other words, I'm speaking and I'm very much aware of who I am as I'm speaking, but I'm also very much aware of how I'm communicating to you. So an example of that is, number 1, as you know, or you might be wondering, is more common in collaborative cultures. Cultures where we want to collaborate, maybe lower power distance. Instead of me just coming and saying, the Bible says, or in case you guys didn't know, treating you like I'm the authority and you guys know nothing, I might come to you and say, now, I'm sure you've thought about this 100 times in your life, and I'll say it anyway. Or, as you probably are well aware, and then I'll say something. What am I doing there? I'm considering my position as a teacher, but I'm also respecting you and raising you up to a level where it decreases the power distance. Okay? Or, oops. Number 2, academics use this more than businesses. Academics tend to use this more than businesses do. There's a lot of skepticism in the academic world, and so a lot of times people, in order not to appear to be know-it-alls, and to have a bad reputation, will do that, okay? I do that a lot of times in the classroom. I'll say, you guys have probably already studied this in another class, but, okay? And I do that because I don't want to treat you guys as though you don't know anything and I'm the fountain of all knowledge and wisdom. That's not a trait in our culture. So that's what dual or double-voiced discourse is. It's considering both sides. D, being culturally intelligent doesn't mean always acting like the people of the host culture. It doesn't always mean acting like the people in the host culture. Paul, if I went to the Democratic Republic of Congo and I tried to imitate the people who live there, what would be their reaction to me?
It would be more like, why are you trying to be connected? Well, not connected, more like imitating the way we do things when you are from a different culture.
Yeah, it can actually be offensive in some cultures. If I went to Germany, Miriam, and I tried to act like a German in every way, your culture is more similar to ours than his would be. Could that be offensive to you if I'm trying to imitate the German people in the way I act and speak?
I don't know if it would be offensive, but it would be weird.
It'd be weird?
Yeah, because I think also because we have so many cultures and like in the country from different countries, like we're used to that.
Yeah.
So it would be like, I don't know,
Yeah.
I think you're weird.
Yeah. When people come to our country from other countries, we expect them to act like citizens of their own countries, okay? So don't feel like cultural intelligence means that you have to, completely put off your Americanisms. That's just not the case. People know you're American, they expect you to be American. I think I told you the story about when I bought a car. I had to get a cheaper car when the economy in Brazil suffered. We lost 30% of our buying power. And I bought a cheaper car, and two very astute people in my congregation were very uncomfortable with that. They didn't tell me at the time, but later on when the economy got better and I bought a little bit nicer car, they breathed a sigh of relief, said, Pastor Mark said, we're so glad you got a better car. That was so awkward when you bought that cheap car. I thought, what? I thought that I was identifying with them and bonding with them in that way, but they looked at it as, you're an American. You should be able to drive a car better than that. Now, there's lots of things we could say about that, a lot of implications, but don't just assume that trying to be like them and imitate them is going to win them. It may backfire. All right, just really quick, suggestions for working with high, low, and low context cultures. Be clear, number one, be clear. 2, apologize when you make mistakes. In a high context culture, rather than, if you make a mistake, you try to use the context to kind of smooth it out and go on. In a low context culture, I'm sorry, I misspoke, or whatever. B, high context, phrase things less directly and apologize anytime harmony is disrupted. So you don't apologize for a mistake you made, you apologize if the harmony of the group is disrupted. In most cultural dimensions, it's equally difficult to cross over, but in the context realm, it's harder for a low context person to move to a high context situation, just in general. If you're used to being specific and you have to give that up, that's usually harder than the contrary. But I got a few other things. I'll save this for next time before we move on, but at least we got the notes filled in. Thank you, guys.